Maite, ¿qué te ha parecido Cliff con su visión sobre la inversión de impacto?
La verdad es que increíble. De hecho, me acuerdo cuando nosotros lanzamos hace 7 años la Fundación Ship2B en 2013. Aquí en España prácticamente la inversión de impacto era un concepto desconocido por la gran mayoría de personas, inversores, emprendedores y gente vinculada al mundo de la economía. A nivel global, la inversión de impacto no llegaba a los 90 billones de dólares y en cambio, gracias a proyectos y a iniciativas como la de GSG en los últimos años, hemos conseguido multiplicar por 10 la inversión en impacto. De hecho, en 2020 estaremos cerca de llegar al trillón de dólares. Con lo cual yo creo que ha sido un gran avance y gracias todo esto a iniciativas que han permitido poder unir, coordinar diferentes agentes que hemos estado trabajando desde hace tiempo para impulsar este emprendimiento social y esta inversión de impacto. Gracias a GSG se han unido emprendedores, inversores, grandes corporaciones, administración pública, entidades sociales, para dar respuesta a estos retos que tenemos a nivel social y a nivel medioambiental. De hecho, si tenemos en cuenta los 17 retos de los ODS, hay mucho todavía por hacer, por resolver, y mi pregunta, Xavi, es si es suficiente solo con la inversión de impacto, porque se estima que necesitaremos alrededor de unos 30 trillones de dólares para dar respuesta a los 17 retos. ¿Crees que es suficiente? ¿Qué rol crees que tiene que tener el ESG, por ejemplo?
Mira, me ha gustado mucho la expresión de Cliff, que ha dicho de los pioneros, ha dicho a las boutiques y al mainstream. Y yo me gustaría hablar de los millones a los billones a los trillones. Ahora apuntabas que Ronald Cohen habla de 30 trillones de dólares en los próximos 10 años para resolver los 17 objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, ¿no? De esos 30 trillones, ¿de dónde van a salir? ¿Quién los va a aportar? ¿Cómo se van a solucionar? Y los mercados financieros a día de hoy te aportan 279 trillones de dólares. Hay 279 trillones de dólares y hay 39 trillones en los mercados financieros que son ESG, que son con criterios de impacto. Pero ¿quién se los cree? ¿Quién se los cree de verdad? ¿Os los creéis vosotros? ¿Creéis que de esos 39 hay uno que es de impacto? Que ese es menos dudoso. Pero los otros 39 son de verdad. Ahora vamos a tener una conversación con BlackRock y con Goldman, que en los últimos meses han hecho anuncios muy importantes. Por ejemplo, BlackRock ha anunciado que va a participar en un pacto con 41 trillones de dólares para el cambio climático. La carta de Larry Fink a todos los CEOs del mundo emplazándoles a invertir con impacto. Goldman anuncia una unidad de sostenibilidad e inversión de impacto. ¿Va esto en serio o es un poco de washing? Ese es el gran debate que queremos tener hoy con todos vosotros. Y sin más, damos entrada a Mirjam Staub-Bisang, a Claire Headley y a Ramón Galcerán, que nos compartirán durante un buen rato este debate entre Goldman y BlackRock sobre el futuro de la inversión de impacto y de la inversión con criterios ESG. Adelante.
Hi everyone. First, thanks to Luis, and thank you, Xavi, also for your words. I want to thank everyone that is attending this roundtable. Let me start by saying that the world of finance today is facing a fundamental change. On the one hand, the traditional commitment to growth, profitability, and return is a must. But nowadays it's going hand in hand with the respect for environment, for social impact, and for sustainable portfolios. This is finally an approach to the canons of impact investments. To discuss about this matter and give us their view on this topic, we have with us today two brilliant professionals from two of the most reputed firms in the investment community, such as BlackRock and Goldman Sachs. On the one hand, we have Mrs. Miriam Staub-Bizan. She's CEO of BlackRock in Switzerland and senior advisor to BlackRock Sustainable Investing. She has developed a successful career in firms such as Merrill Lynch, Quadrant, or Commerzbank, and she also established her own asset management and real estate advisory firm. She has written several publications, among which we can find one called Sustainable Investing for Institutional Investors, a very adequate title for today's topic. On the other hand, we have Mrs. Claire Hadley. Claire is the executive director at Goldman Sachs. She has developed a great and successful career in different positions at Goldman Sachs, including private equity product management, hedge funds, operational and business due diligence, and hedge funds product. She has, as I said, she has developed a very successful career to become the executive director for alternative investments, and is now leading the ESG and impact investments in Goldman Sachs in London. Thanks, Claire and Miriam. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to have you both here to help us see the light on this topic. Just to set the main goals that I would expect on this roundtable, I would like you to share with the ESG and the impact investment community that is seeing us, that is watching us today, helping understand how your organizations are facing this challenge, and explain to the community why this is a real bet and it's not only a face-washing step, and help us understand how your firms have oriented their strategies and what specific steps they have taken towards this commitment and to measure such impacts. So as we have limited time, let me go straight to the first question. I would ask you straightforward, in your view, according to your experience, what works and what does not work in the environmental, social, and governance investing? Let's start by Miriam, for instance.
Yes, thank you. That was a great introduction and so complimentary. It's such a great pleasure for me to be part of this panel, especially as this is taking place in Spain. I feel almost like now I'm in Spain, but I'm sitting in my office here in Zurich. Now, what works and what doesn't work in impact investing? I think it's a good question, and I think it goes to the core of what sustainable and impact investing is. Impact investing, sustainable investing is not about black and white. There's not what works and what doesn't work. There's no right and wrong, but rather I see sustainable and impact investing as shades of green. And different approaches work for different investor types in different regions, obviously. And so what we see, be that in Switzerland or also across Europe, EMEA, we see a lot of interest for thematic and impact strategies with wealth managers and their private clients. So there, really the focus is on having an impact and believing in certain long-term investment themes and trends. And with institutional investors, the focus is slightly different. The focus of pension funds and insurance companies is very much on the risks, on sustainability risks, climate change risks. And from that aspect, these clients focus on strategies like ESG integrations, and now actually more and more on best-in-class approaches. They want to invest with the most sustainable companies because they feel from a risk-return perspective, it's the best way they can set up themselves to benefit from that trend and to address risks in a best way. What we see is that investors who started with exclusion now actually almost move up the food chain and want to go more like in more impactful strategies, both from a risk perspective, but also from a return and impact perspective.
Thanks, Miriam. What's your view, Claire?
Yeah, thank you, and a pleasure to be here today. I also wish I was in Spain, but I'll put up with the British weather instead. But no, look, I think a lot of the comments I'd make are very in line with Miriam, that ESG, it's not just about doing good. This is about seeing sustainability as a key driver of opportunity and growth. And increasingly, we see ESG as as an opportunity for value creation. There has to be a focus on both risk and opportunity. And if you can move away from some of the more kind of morals and values-based discussions and anchor this in an investment framework, you can definitely move forward. I don't think this is a question anymore of whether we do ESG, it's how do we do it and how do we do it well. And as Miriam said, this is not one thing or another. There's different approaches and different tools that can be used. I think one of the things that's hard for this space and that maybe doesn't work in this space as well is the acronyms and the jargon, and it can lead to a lot of mismessaging, misconceptions and sort of barriers. And while this hasn't always sounded like investing, as it kind of transforms now and as it moves more in that direction, you have to ground this in a research thesis, in an investment thesis. And so, I think to continue this moving forward as to be an investment topic and an investment concern, I'd say there's three things that I'd highlight that work. The first is that you have to ground this in an investment thesis. It has to be research driven for it to work. And for people, particularly investment professionals, to understand it. And you have to treat it with the same rigor, the same thought, the same kind of care as any other investment question. This isn't different. And this is hard, right? It's hard work. It's going to take commitment to get there. Secondly, I'd say that ESG is core. It shouldn't be a separate function. It needs to be fully integrated in other investment functions, things like risk management, like asset allocation, like reporting. You have to really embed it in the core of what you're doing. And thirdly, very much in line with what Miriam said, think of this as a process, not as an act. Right? There are different tools, there's different things you can do across a portfolio. And we've seen investors get really stuck if they try to take it all on at once and do every single thing in their portfolio. And so I think we kind of say, if you can take a step back, if you can break ESG down into subcomponent parts, if you can find an entry point, you can get started and you'll iterate from there over time. The industry's evolving, the approaches are evolving, and that's fine for your strategy and for your investments to evolve over time as well.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. Let me try to relate ESG strategies and the sustainable development goals. What could be the best ESG strategies to comply with Agenda 2030 regarding the SDGs goals, the Sustainable Development Goals? Let's start by Claire. Let's combine the question.
Mix it up. Okay. So I think I'd build on this concept that we've talked about, that there's different approaches and different tools that will achieve different objectives. And we use a framework of left tail and right tail. So if you think about the left tail being your downside risk, where are the risks that you would manage in a portfolio? So think about a topic like climate change. There are going to be assets in your portfolio that would be negatively impacted from climate change. So what are the strategies and things you can do to prepare for the downside, for the risk? And then on the right tail, what's the upside? Where are the opportunities, these secular growth trends, these changes that are coming about? Where's the opportunity that you can take advantage of and find alpha from? And in the middle, there's kind of this opportunity to improve or to enhance core competencies around climate change. So that could be in how you integrate scenario analysis or climate data into companies or manager selection, for example. And really, you have to take a look at those different types of strategies that will all contribute in different ways to the SDGs. If we think about the funding gap required or financing gap for the SDGs, it's quoted at $2.5 to $3 trillion a year. So there is plenty of investment opportunity to sort of contribute towards these goals, and different tools to do that. Think about some of the markets that are more kind of nascent and that are growing. Green bonds green bonds within fixed income seeing huge momentum. We saw 200 billion euros worth of issuances in green bonds last year. So that's really starting to have some traction, where those proceeds are cordoned off for specific environmental projects that could contribute towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Thematic equities or thematic funds also often have that lens towards them. And I think private markets is also another place where you can put capital to work, sort of directly to work to contribute towards the SDGs. And we manage a large private markets impact fund for a European pension. And part of the requirement of that is to invest across our 8 impact themes and then to track and to measure the output of those investments towards their own sustainability, so corporate sustainability goals, but also towards the SDGs. And so I think those private market investments across both climate themes and social themes, things like education and healthcare, there's lots of different ways that you can implement different strategies to move forward to solve some of these huge challenges that we have.
Wow, I think that was great, Claire. And I should, just to make it interesting for the audience, I don't want to reiterate anything that was said, because a lot of it applies as well to BlackRock. When I think about private market strategies, actually this morning I had a very interesting conversation with our private debt team. And I thought, wow, to what extent can a private debt investor, can we as a private debt investor have an impact on companies? Shouldn't this just be limited to equity investors, like private equity investors? And it was interesting what the team said. They said, yes, of course, as long as we invest alongside impact private equity investors and provide the private debt, we know that if we're aligned with the private equity GP, general partner, we can also add to that impact if we then kind of add some financial incentives to our debt investments and say, well, your interest rate that you have to pay for this private debt financing will be lower if you reach certain impact or sustainability goals. And I thought that was actually interesting. They can really push the agenda as well in private debt. I think we're going to see much more in that area as well, especially in light of the European sustainability agenda, agenda of the European Commission. Why is that? It's because all institutional investors and obviously eventually also private investors, but institutional investors, they will have to lay out, will have to report to what extent they contribute to the climate goals and the sustainability goals of the European Commission. So any investment they hold, and especially in private markets, will have an impact component. They will have to report on that. So eventually they will require from their asset managers, from their private market investors, that they will report their impact. So I think that's going to be a huge push. And perhaps in addition to the green bonds, I think there's a very interesting market emerging now on transition bonds. Personally, I think that's going to be just huge, because what are transition bonds? They actually finance the transition of, we call them brown companies to green companies. And so the company doesn't have to be green. This is not about renewable energy financing. This is about helping companies to transition to be successful companies in a low carbon environment. So I think that's going to be interesting. It's also going to be very interesting for investors and impact investors. And perhaps the last point, impact, and I think we'll come to that later, but there's a huge focus now on impact through engagement. How can you push the sustainability agenda of a company as a shareholder, as a large shareholder like BlackRock or Goldman Sachs, and how can you kind of relate that engagement to an outcome? And personally, I feel that's kind of the next frontier in impact investing, clearly.
Thank you, Miriam. Yeah, I agree that the more players, the more institutions, the higher the volumes that are committed to this approach, the more effective and this will be. Xavi, in the introduction, I think he was explaining that we come from investing millions, now we are at the phase of investing billions, and when the trillions arrive, that will really create the real impact of that we are all looking for. You were mentioning that there have been in the last years many investments on climate change. I wanted to ask you, before the pandemic, investors seemed to be focused on climate change related investments. That's the E of the ESG. Let's put it that way. Now with the pandemic, it seems that there comes a focus on the S of the ESG, the social. No, are you following also this pattern? Are you moving or investing in environment, but also on social now?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and I think COVID-19 in that sense might be a blessing in disguise. I mean, COVID was a humanitarian and a health crisis which started in Asia. It started with a supply crisis, turned into a demand crisis, and suddenly the focus of investors was, how resilient are supply chains? How much do companies look at health and safety of their employees? How big is customer loyalty, and what will be the effects of how companies handle these crises on the long-term prosperity of these companies? How will customers eventually react if companies lay off thousands and thousands of employees, and especially in emerging economies, push them back into poverty? And here, perhaps a very short personal story. I am, next to my role at BlackRock, I'm on the board of a global retailing company, Bata, the shoe company. And there I really experienced that crisis firsthand. It started with the supply crisis in January, where we couldn't source these shoes anymore, and then moved on to a demand crisis when we had to close the shops in Asia, close the shops in India, close the shops in Europe, eventually close the shops in Latin America. And it was brutal. It's brutal to a company, it's brutal to cash flows, and eventually you have to, as a board as well, you have to make close calls. To what extent are you willing to supply fresh capital to make sure that these people stay employed throughout the crisis and still have a job when we return to normality? Because as a company, Bata is very, very much committed to responsible capitalism and not to hire and fire. And these are tough questions that many company boards and CEOs had to decide during this crisis. But back to BlackRock, we actually did some research on the performance of companies during the market sell-off during the COVID crisis in March. And we found that companies with good social ratings actually proved to be much more resilient during the crisis and performed better than companies who didn't have these strong S ratings, because the loyalty of customers, clients was higher, and the supply chains were just much more resilient. So yes, it's an area we watch much more precisely, but also in the past, obviously, we've engaged with companies for a long time on social issues, be that human capital management, culture, diversity, and inclusion. But now I think the crisis has brought the spotlight on S, and I don't think it's going to go away. S is here to stay, and it will make a difference to performance, and it will make a difference for investors, and it's not kind of just this fluffy topic that it used to be, because it can really make a difference on financials.
Sure.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would agree there. And the focus historically was more on the E and the G, and the pandemic has really propelled S, into the front seat alongside those other two factors. And I think what had been the challenge with the S factors, and still remains a challenge to a certain extent, is that they are, Miriam just said the word fluffy, right? It's just a little bit less tangible. There's less data availability. There's been a lot more focus from organizations like SASB and TCFD to improve the quality and measurability of data around some of the E factors. And so the S, we still have some work to do in terms of actual data and uniformity across S factors. But I think the companies aren't able to hide behind, positive headlines or, stories around S anymore. This is all being put to the test, and COVID has shone a big light on that. And the S factors certainly are a key operational question that needs to be embedded in analysis. I think, just to avoid, again, repetition with too much overlap, I would say that the pandemic overall, I think, has been a really good stress test for ESG, right? It kind of, as we came into this year, there was a huge amount of momentum behind the ESG. We were almost at sort of the peak. And I think this question started to circulate on, you know, is this just a luxury we have during a relatively calm period for markets? Is it going to be able to withstand a period of volatility and sort of a market stress and some test? And so I think as this has played out over the last 6 to 8 months, we've really seen the answer be yes. And we've seen that in a few places, right? The first is flows. We've had record flows this year into ESG funds through July, $150 billion of inflows into ESG strategies. Non-ESG strategies have had outflows. Performance, the other big question, can these funds actually perform? Do these strategies work? And we've seen year to date over the past 12 months and over the past 3 years, nearly half of all the ESG funds have performed in their top quartile of their Morningstar universes. So we're starting to see some evidence in the performance as well, which is great. And the third metric I suppose I'd use to measure is client focus. So across the spectrum of clients that we engage with, we're really back to the same level of engagement with clients on this subject. You know, everyone from CIOs and asset management heads within our investment management division through to kind of C-suite and CEOs, CFOs of corporates, everybody very engaged on the sustainability agenda. And so I think it's just helped provide some momentum and acceleration of this trend that we started seeing come into the mainstream pre-crisis.
Thank you, Claire. Over the last few years, your organizations have made great efforts to enter what we could call the impact space. I'd like you to take this opportunity to explain the community that's watching us, to explain them how profound and how real this bet is. I mean, how would you respond to those people in the market that argue that sometimes these decisions seem to be more oriented to be a greenwashing strategy rather than a real commitment?
Yeah.
Claire.
So I think the story at Goldman goes back way more than the last kind of 2 years. You know, back in 2005, we had our first environmental policy framework. We created GS Sustain in 2007, a dedicated team in our global investment research to focus on ESG factors in company analysis. We joined PRI in 2011. So there's been steps kind of over more than the last decade where that we've taken towards sustainability. In 2015, we made an acquisition of a firm called Imprint Capital that was a boutique specialist ESG and impact investment firm. That really helped improve, add to the research and the resourcing in this space, particularly within our investment management division. So I think, there's been steps, and this is certainly an evolution and a journey that we all continue on. Perhaps it's been a little bit more publicly, captured in the last couple of years. And the couple of steps we've taken in the last 2 years or so was first to form our sustainable finance group. So that's a team now that sits within the executive office division of the firm and works across all of the different divisions, from investment banking to global markets to investment management and private wealth, to drive the sustainability agenda, to make sure that there's collaboration and innovation and really drive that forward. So that's been a really big step last year. And secondly, we announced a target at the end of last year to invest, advise or finance on $750 billion over the next 10 years across 2 core themes. This is climate transition and inclusive growth. So climate, things you would think of, clean energy, sustainable transport. Inclusive growth, we mean things like better access and affordability in education and healthcare. And the reason I think that this bet works and that we can put a big number out there is because this is really grounded in a core view that these are 2 macro themes of the way that the world is going. And they're having a material economic impact on our business, on the way our clients are doing business. And if you think about sort of the secular trends that are driving these themes, we've got increased evidence of climate change. The consequences are real and they're apparent, and there's a sense of urgency around this that I think hasn't existed in the past. We're seeing preferences changing. I think in the early days, this was all down to millennials that wanted to live differently, invest differently. But actually, there's a lot more of us now that are thinking about our decisions in the way that we shop, we eat, we live, that are driving different things. Regulators are engaging, companies are engaging. So it's coming from all angles. And finally, these trends are driving efficiency, they're driving growth, such that the sort of investment and the business opportunity makes a lot of sense today. And so really, I guess the bet that we're making and the belief that we have is that climate transition and inclusive growth are sort of at the intersection of opportunity and necessity. And so we can really lean into that with the full kind of weight of the business rather than it being something smaller and on the side.
Thanks, Claire.
Yeah, I can't build on Claire's comment now for BlackRock in that sense. No, our journey in sustainable investing and impact investing has been a long one, but I would say captured a lot of attention of the top leadership of the firm, and resulted in public commitments, very similarly to Goldman Sachs in January 2020, when in our yearly letter to CEOs, we came out with very clear commitments towards integration of sustainability risk in investment processes, increasing the range of investments, in sustainable investments and impact investments and engagement. And I think especially on the last 2 points, when we related to impact, we really took very, very big steps. As we had been managing green bond mandates for close to a decade now, and so have been impact investors and have been investing in private asset infrastructure, and have infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure, and have been impact investors there already. It hasn't been so distinct and so publicly communicated as well. So with that renewed effort and focus on impact, we also added a listed equity impact strategy at the end of last year, and defined our product framework in that sense to include listed equity impact strategies as well. And then lastly, we've done a huge effort in increasing our engagement on sustainability topics, be that on social topics, climate-related topics, and started to measure that impact, try to relate it to relate outcomes to engagement, causality versus correlation. I mean, there are these questions, but we also published a number of case studies on our engagement activities to highlight how we engage with companies and what the impact is that we're pushing for. We increased our hirings on our stewardship team, and now actually employ probably the world's largest stewardship team to engage with companies globally. So that's it, I think, in a nutshell. I'm just cognizant of time here, so don't want to take too long.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. I still have 2 more questions, and we're really, really running out of time. So I would appreciate quick answers on these 2 very important, but the last question. So I please ask you to be brief on your answers. The first question is related to metrics. How are you dealing with, measuring these impacts? How you measuring and managing the performance of the Sustainable Development Goals? How are you dealing with this in your organizations?
Yeah, so if I can get started on environmental issues, we had developed a framework, a long-standing framework actually with green bonds investments already, and there it's really about measuring less CO2 emissions, saves water, etc. And here our approach is the more we invest, the more capital we invest, the higher the sustainability outcomes, the higher the impact. So it's a direct correlation of money invested and impacts achieved. I think that's an important aspect. And on shareholder engagement, I already said it, it's hard to measure the impact because it's hard to actually link the direct engagement to an outcome. But we'll do a lot more work there in the years to come. So I believe that aspect will change as well. But in summary, what gets measured gets managed. The more we measure, the more we'll achieve outcomes.
Makes sense. Thanks, Miriam.
Yeah, and I think that the role of capital and the associated impact sort of varies by asset class, right? And it is harder to measure in public markets, particularly impact. So we tend to think of it more thematically in public markets. And I think engagement and stewardship is another important tool in terms of actually driving change and making progress. But agree, it's hard to measure. And for us, impact really is synonymous with measurability and with counting. And that's where I think the private market impact can lend itself, more in that space, because you're applying capital directly to those businesses. There's sort of a proximity of that capital to the solutions. And how we measure this is, we spend a lot of time within our imprint team where we work with external GPs or external managers to invest in impact. We spend a lot of time in the due diligence process defining what the right metrics are to measure for their different strategies and for those different investments, because they're going to be different for different types of investors and different themes within sustainability broadly. And so we spend a lot of time defining those, and then managers report on those, and we're able to put together annual impact reports for our clients that are invested in those portfolios, where we can actually report on both the qualitative impact of those investments and the quantitative metrics and that measurability. So I'd say the sort of the measurement of the impact, we're probably more active in the private markets. And the team's been doing that for more than a decade, and we're building an improving data set of metrics, because there's no industry standard. There's no magic line really of what counts in impact, and so we're building out a data set as we invest in more companies and get more of those metrics.
Thank you very much, Claire. So this is the last question. And again, be as brief as possible, because we're really running out of time now. It is related to the situation in 2020. This year has really disrupted many strategic plans due to the current situation. How has this affected your sustainability strategy? Claire.
Disruptive year. Well, it certainly has been disruptive. And I think, in early March, when the pandemic sort of hit, we held our breath for a couple of weeks there and just thought, what is this going to take a backseat? Is this all going to take a backseat to survival? And I think, I gave some of those measurable examples earlier of why we think that this has emerged stronger from the pandemic. So I don't think there's been sort of big impact to strategy. I think the timing's been good around the setup of the Sustainable Finance Group, having sustainability sort of councils within each of the divisions, is that sort of the formative work was done before this hit, such that we haven't had to worry about sort of operating structure and sort of the investment emphasis of this. So, it continues to be a top of mind agenda item for us at Goldman Sachs and for a lot of the clients that we're engaging with on a daily basis. And I think, around the world, as we look at policy, there's a lot of changes, there's a lot of targets in the world. The direction of travel, I think, is clear. Some divergence in implementation, but I think a really clear direction of the direction we're headed in.
Thanks, Claire.
Yeah, I can only add to that. The crisis actually didn't change the strategy, it just reinforced it. I think the good investment results of sustainable strategy also paid into that. Simply put, I think COVID does not stop climate change. Climate change is investment risk, and sustainability risks are investment risks. That does not change, and clients are more than ever focused on looking at that.
Well, Claire, Miriam, thank you so much for all your input. I think we're taking very valuable ideas from this session. I want to thank you and thank also all the audience that's been following this roundtable. And again, I hope this is just the beginning of a new era. Let me finish by saying that yesterday I was reading the interview of the CEO of Mirova, one of the relevant players in the sustainable investment community, and one of his final ideas was he was saying something like, private investors, funds, we do have a capacity to have some impact, a little impact, but when the world of finance gets together with society, well, that has a huge, powerful combination. So let's hope that sees the light and that the new coming years follow that trend. Thank you very much. Thank you all. And I recommend you to follow the next panel with Cristina Marsal, managing a roundtable regarding real impact or impact washing. Thank you all. Thank you very much.